Peanuts is on Apple Plus. Did you know that? Is that common knowledge? It's been there for a while now, and despite at least carrying the name of one of the most important works in not just animation history, but comic and television history, the world seems fairly mum on it. Clips on YouTube don't get a lot of views. It's tough to find people talking about watching it on insert social media site of choice here. One might even go as far as to say that Apple Plus spent God knows how much money on a catalog of outdated cartoons and is only making new ones out of either obligation or fear of missing out. But is this response warranted? Do these cartoons deserve to be relegated to the trash can of time? Well, to spoil it for you, there's more going on with these, and they're definitely worth your time. And if you'll give me some of your time, I think I'll be able to explain why. So, ultra quick Peanuts primer. This guy, Charles Schulz, comes back from World War II and decides that he's going to make a cartoon vaguely based off his life. He does this from 1950 all the way until the year of his passing in 2000. The first animated special, A Charlie Brown Christmas, comes out in 1965 and kind of changes television forever. Despite its somewhat crude visuals, or perhaps because of, its simple yet powerful message resonated heavily with people. Nobody had seen anything like it on TV, much less a cartoon, so elegantly handle these nuanced emotional situations. Charlie's melancholy is handled with honesty and without talking down to the audience. Combined with the utterly timeless score by Vince Guaraldi, it would remain a permanent fixture on American television sets in December for forever, basically. A pillar of broadcast television animation was erected and immediately pierced the heavens, an untouchable moment if there ever was one. Over the next 35 years, 39 specials would be produced, up until Schultz's passing. Without his supervisions, the specials became less and less frequent before going into full-on hibernation after 2011. Then, for reasons I'll leave you to speculate on, Apple announces they've purchased the streaming rights to the Peanuts specials, and also that they would be producing some of their own. Curious to see if these would be as potentially disastrous as they could be, I sat down and watched the 4 specials currently released, For Auld Lang Syne in 2021, and It's the Small Things Charlie Brown, To Mom and Dad with Love, and Lucy's School in 2022. To my surprise, they weren't just good, they were great. And they were great in a way I feel may be easy to gloss over. So, to prep for these, I took a quick skim through that back catalog. Wasn't going to watch all 45 produced beforehand, but a selection I felt was representative. I watched a handful that I had seen, a handful that I hadn't seen. I even rewatched the Blue Sky movie from 2015. When it comes to modernizing these specials, a lot of the actual updating was done visually. As I'm going to explain in a tremendous amount of detail, the presentation of these specials was handled with a tremendous amount of care and, more importantly, a tremendous amount of thought. And it's more important to the overall package than you might expect. First, this question is less technical and more philosophical. Should the Peanuts specials be presented with high fidelity? That first in 1965 definitely could not have been broadcast with advanced technology. Most television sets in America at that time were in black and white. Some might argue that the lo-fi and crude nature of that and every other Peanuts special is part of the experience, that it represents the kind of grit and ugliness that exists in the real world. That rounding those edges and removing that would overly sanitize the visuals, an important aspect in a visual storytelling medium. However, one might also argue the opposite. These unbelievably crisp 4K rescans from a few years ago, which Apple Plus has access to and is continuing to do further on in the catalog, definitely have higher fidelity than any television from that era could produce. However, if you had access to the original film, it had plenty of fidelity on it. Film as a format has tons of fidelity and can produce very crisp images if projected correctly. It was just the endpoint devices that failed to capture this, a fact which shouldn't really factor into the equation. It should also be stated that some crudeness is actually enhanced by the increase in resolution. On a high PPI, bright and color accurate display, every last grain of dirt and imperfect line is captured with such clarity that it almost jumps out of the screen. I consider both of these arguments salient, but I'll leave the answer in your hands. What matters is that the techniques used to make those specials feel the way they were are antiquated, but perhaps the feeling they inspired could be replicated. Let's start from the top. So, that first special in '65 was a little lumpier, a little rougher around the edges than it needed to be. This was pretty obviously due to the fairly extreme crunch that the film was made under. The following specials would maintain a fairly solidly consistent visual style through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, but come the new millennium, animating on traditional cells with ink was no longer a viable means. The specials of the aughts, seen by few and remembered by fewer, definitely lacked something beyond Schultz's writing. The last one, 2011's Happiness is a Warm Blanket, Charlie Brown, is definitely the best version of this particular era of Peanut specials. Judging this one specifically, as it was the first to be broadcast in HD and the last one before Apple Plus, is about as charitable as I think I should be in this case. It's not like the whole industry wasn't struggling with digital animation in the early aughts anyway. If the specials continued to be produced by these people under these conditions, I doubt they would have ever looked better than this. I'm also doing it because I cannot find the others in decent quality, and I think some were only ever released on VHS. So, all things considered, I'd say that the visuals are adequate though slightly underwhelming. Everybody's designs are tweaked to more closely resemble the original comics, though you'd be forgiven for not being able to tell the difference either way. Color and saturation are an important thing to take note of when transitioning from traditional to digital. Even the best transitions from the most notable shows to go through this process are generally guilty of having softer, muted tones turn into brighter, more saturated ones. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as some changes will have to be made regardless, but it goes to show how nearly all aspects of the visuals have to be re-examined one way or another. Just put that thought away for later. This special makes an almost pathological attempt to stay as true to the style of the original cartoons as possible, palette very much included. Colors are muted and line work is soft, in an attempt to replicate the naturalistic colors and line work you'd get from real ink on a plastic celluloid. This is becoming more in vogue now, using digital means to emulate the natural imperfections of traditional animation. Most recently, I recall seeing it on Ranking of Kings. Longtime watchers of the channel may also remember seeing it in Long Way North. The fairly extreme measure of adding a grain filter to the image, which YouTube's compression will be completely unable to convey to you, so take my word on it, has been done as well. Backgrounds are kept simple with pastel colors. Great care was taken to keep the colors and lines and blotches of paint as natural looking as possible, to the point where it almost wanders into being straight up abstraction. Character animation is also kept extremely simple, actually even simpler than those earliest Peanut specials, which were never light on movement. The animation was simply a little too crude to really convey the motion with much fluidity. This has tons of fluidity, but isn't using that to delineate complex movements. It's like a reverse in that case. Long story short, it's pretty rare to see a digital animation take so many steps in an attempt to look more traditional, especially back in 2011 when digital animation had only been universal on TV for around a decade. A lot of effort went into making this look like something that was made on a small budget from another century, despite the fact that it should be plainly obvious that a tremendous amount of time, effort, skill, and money went into the visuals for this cartoon. And in that sense, I'd say the visuals were a success. This brings us neatly to the other Peanuts revival time forgot, the 2015 Blue Sky movie, and while doing too little was the issue with the latter broadcast specials, this one definitely went in the other direction. YouTube compression is going to annihilate these details, but believe me, I can count every strand of hair on everyone's head. I can see the textures on everybody's clothing, and it makes for an extremely uncanny effect. Everybody's still animated as if it were those classic low-budget specials. The frame rate is kept low for aesthetic purposes. This is something pretty common in pseudo 2D animation now, but it was not back then, and nothing is being done to bridge the gap between the immense amount of visual fidelity combined with the extra depth that comes from 3D animation and the humble 2D roots that it's attempting to emulate. The flatness of the Peanuts specials is critically important, and 3D lighting, which clearly shows those contours and curves on what used to be a flat amorphous blob, runs totally contrary to that ethos. Another important aspect to consider is the backgrounds. The backgrounds in the original specials were obviously as hand-painted as everything else. Even Happiness attempted to replicate that style, as I mentioned before. However, the backgrounds in Peanuts 2015 look like they could have been taken from any other animated feature from its era. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. The backgrounds are as detailed as the character models, but they lack the congruity to make the image as a whole actually feel unified. The characters might still appear flat, less flat than before, but still relatively so, but the backgrounds are clearly projecting in tremendous amounts of depth. These come to a head most prominently in the Red Baron scenes, which I still like due to their creativity, but nowhere else does it feel like you're caught in no man's land between 2D and 3D. Remember how I mentioned that the increased clarity on those 4K scans of the classic specials was offset by the fact that it also made the grit and grime on each frame more visible? The 2015 Peanuts movie is like the exact opposite. It's not that it doesn't work all the time, but there are a few shots in this movie where I swear it's like I'm looking at one of those tasteless, tactless Mario and Unreal Engine videos. Making a 3D movie look like a 2D movie is all the rage now, obviously, but it was a pretty novel thing back in 2015. Spider-Verse wouldn't come out for years, Guilty Gear Xrd was brand new, Paperman was a few years old, but that was going for a pretty different thing. Its use of traditional, exaggerated 2D techniques like smear frames and squash and stretch are admirable to say the least. I'm not against the idea of 3D lighting being applied to 2D characters, I'll make that clear in a few moments, but I do take issue with how 3D aspects were flattened in this movie. A lot has changed in the animation landscape in the last 7 years. If this movie came out today, I'm nearly 100% confident that these aesthetic issues would have been handled differently. But, as it stands, the Peanuts movie's visuals just don't quite carry the spirit of the specials all too effectively. It definitely doesn't translate into a modern sense as well as it could. Which finally brings us back to 2021 and the modern Peanut specials. In a lot of ways, the newer cartoons are like a blend between that 2015 movie and Happiness. Characters are once again flat, hand-drawn in 2D, but with an extremely sophisticated 3D lighting engine. I first recall seeing 3D lighting on 2D characters way back in 2013 with Rayman Legends, and again, most recently, with Klaus from 2019. It's a fairly unexplored space, probably due to the immense technical and artistic challenge it presents. But it's a challenge worth taking. I want to talk about the lighting specifically for a little while because, frankly, it's the most drastic change, and at least personally, it's the most interesting one going from Happiness in the 2015 movie. So, as I said before, these specials use 3D lighting techniques. This allows them to cast shadows and have rim lighting. It also allows light to bounce off of them and onto them realistically and consistently. A lot of the time, it's kept relatively simple, and sometimes it's deceptively complex. This use of a 3D lighting engine is good at keeping visual unity. Foreground elements and background elements are being lit by the same source. Sometimes background elements are even being affected by foreground elements and vice versa. Everything looks like it's occupying the same space, and since it's all ultimately 2D, there isn't that strange effect you would get in a few scenes in the 2015 Peanuts movie. Ultimately, it makes all the characters feel more like they're actually occupying the spaces that they're in and makes each frame as a whole seem more cohesive. The lighting is the glue that holds the frame together and keeps everything straight and in check. It's not just there to be flashy, it's there for a good reason. However, some might argue that all this cohesion is just another word for noise. Grain aside, those original Peanut specials had a tremendous amount of clarity and simplicity in every frame. One could argue that all of this is distracting from that original, ultra-simplistic look that the original had, which accentuated the emotional pathos on screen. Less clutter and noise on the screen, laying all the emotional nuances bare with nowhere to hide. Obscuring that with some fancy-pants lighting system is antithetical to the visual language of Peanuts as a whole, and that is a valid criticism of this particular aesthetic choice. The lighting does distract from the clarity, and it does add more elements on screen to contend with. However, I would respond to that criticism by reminding you all that lighting is an extremely powerful technique, surprise surprise. Some of the most iconic scenes in cinema owe a lot to their lighting. One might think lighting would be difficult to implement in animation, but many have tried and many have succeeded. Lighting is an important aspect of any visual media because it's an effective way to convey emotions. Now, all of this may sound surface level and like I'm misrepresenting the argument which I myself made. The efficacy of lighting is not in question, it's that complex lighting goes against the visual language of those early Peanut specials, and to that I would say, do you recall Linus' speech in that first special? Maybe one of the most iconic monologues in animation and even television history. Do you remember the first words he says before he even starts?
Lights, please.
The first special, the foundational text to which all other Peanut specials draw upon, in a stunning sense of poetic irony, like it was gospel, understands the value of lighting. Ultimately, the Peanut specials, the good ones anyway, are about that emotional pathos. They're about bearing the sometimes painful and confusing elements of life, then confronting them, then overcoming them. And there's nothing wrong or superfluous with using a lighting system, rudimentary or complex, to enhance those feelings. It's all just another tool in the toolbox. How it's used is more important than whether or not it's used at all. But there's nothing fundamentally wrong or misguided or even inaccurate about using it. Anyway, that overly long bout of intellectual shadow boxing aside, how do these new Peanut specials use this lighting to enhance the story? All I've done was argue that it wasn't against the spirit of the series, nor a pointless endeavor in theory. I haven't actually explained how it's used in practice, and in practice, it's used extremely effectively. I already mentioned how it's used to unify the image and keep a visual through line, but it's most significantly used, like how it was used back then, to enhance emotion. In dramatic scenes, it's cranked up to a point where it's pretty difficult not to notice. However, Peanuts is still about simplicity, so the emotional goal of the scene is always clear. Lucy, defeated and dejected, is on her bed and shrouded in darkness. Linus enters through a beam of light and remains there as he attempts to drag his sister out of her melancholy. And as she gradually crawls out of her sadness, she leaves her dark bedroom into a slightly brighter hallway. Charlie and Linus comfort her and explain they understand her feelings, and all three of them are connected emotionally, but they're all also lit by the ambient light coming from outside the hallway. And finally, as Lucy is raised up out of her sorrow, she walks toward the light, and the frame is aflush with color and vibrance. Everyone from the neighborhood is around. Lucy is overwhelmed. The light has conveyed the emotions of the scene, and there is stunning visual harmony. Now, one could say that everything I just described are peripheral. It's what I came here to discuss, but still, they are frosting on the cake, and at the core of what would make or break these specials would still be the writing. I would disagree with that, but it is based in some truth. Yes, the actual events of the narrative are critically important and should be addressed as such. Beyond the jokes, beyond the catchphrases, beyond the visual gags, what is Peanuts? What makes these specials valuable? If I had to condense it into a single sentence, it would be how I described Christmas some 7 or 8 hours ago: nuanced emotions handled with intellectual honesty. Again, using Christmas as our template, the special begins by explaining, in no uncertain terms, what the emotional conflict of the following cartoon is going to be. Charlie says to Linus that he feels a disconnect between the positive feelings he thinks he's supposed to have and the sadness he's actually feeling. This disconnect itself exacerbates his sadness further. Over the course of the special, Charlie will confront his feelings, attempt to overcome them, fail, gain a new perspective, and ultimately will triumph over them. He'll do this not by destroying some physical representation, but through self-reflection and applying the insight he's gained over the course of the special. And through that final bout of introspection will come the emotional crescendo that the entire special will have been building up to. A final moment where all the tension is released and all becomes well, doubly so since the melancholy that the viewer had to go through will make you feel that much more earned. It's rock simple, but it's the nuance that makes it all work, the way it carries itself. But if I were to lay out a skeleton, that would be it. However, going through that entire skeleton wouldn't really get my point across effectively. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of characters and references, yes, but it's still not expecting the audience to be too familiar with these characters. It's been a long time since the Peanuts were actually culturally relevant to most people in cartoon form. Still, I think the most straightforward way to illustrate it for you would be to show you how it handles an emotional crescendo. Everything that comes before it can turn into so much background noise as all the themes coalesce into a single scene where all that narrative tension explodes all at once. With just one good scene, it can turn a kind of average special into something that can literally bring a grown man to tears. Christmas is the most iconic, of course, with Linus quoting the good book and the tree becoming the symbol of everyone's growth and their acceptance of Charlie, as well as their acceptance of the themes of the special. The legendary arrangement of A Christmas Tree by Vince Guaraldi serenading them as they and you reflect on all that's happened. Charlie was sad, he went through some troubles, he gained newfound understanding, and now he has the tools to deal with his sadness. It's all so simple, so poignant. All too often in media, whether it be all ages media or not, these emotional moments are handled clumsily. They either lack the emotional nuance, which means the actual emotion of the scene will fail to reach the audience since it doesn't resemble natural human emotions enough, or it lacks intellectual honesty, which means the emotion may get through, but only on a very surface level, and will fail to reach the heights it could. One isn't enough, you need both. The former without the latter is shallow, the latter without the former is melodramatic, and both of these are manipulative since it fails to grasp the full breadth of the human experience. Fortunately, these 7-year-olds, they got it all figured out. Each emotional climax in each Peanut special is handled with all the care and finesse one could possibly hope for. Let's zero in on the one from To Mom and Dad. Patty is distraught. A long and arduous day of feeling left out of Mother's Day activities on account of not having a mother has finally truly crushed her spirit. She sits beneath a tree as she's bathed in the warm yet harsh glow of the sunset. As much as I want to gush about the use of color here, or this really good zoom effect on Patty's monologue where Marcy slowly goes out of focus, I will contain myself and just talk about what's being said.
Every now and then, my dad says to me, "Peppermint Patty, do you know what you are?" And I always say no. Then he says to me, You are a rare gem. And then we laugh about it. But sometimes I wish I wasn't so rare.
What Patty is saying isn't some complex metaphor or an out-of-touch non-issue. She doesn't have a mother in her life, and she's not alright. This is a real thing that real people go through, and there's no easy solution to the way she's feeling, and she's letting you know it. Fortunately, Marcy is there to drag her good friend out of her soul-shattering spiral by reminding her of a few simple truths, but also by asking her a pretty innocuous question. And that's enough to get Patty to remember how much her father means to her, regardless of her having a mother or not. And it's at this moment that she realized that it's not about having or not having a mother specifically, it's about what a mother does, not as a mother. Linus, ever the poet, explains all of this in his ending monologue about his mom and wraps up the themes of the special quite nicely. A mom isn't someone to be valued or cherished on the grounds of them being a mom. It's what they do for you and how much they care about you that makes them worthy of these things. So often in our society we get caught up on labels and trying to conform and obsessing over the minute differences in our situations versus everyone else's, and these things can tear you to pieces if you're not careful. But all it takes is for you to take a few steps back, examine what you've got in your life, and realize that these labels are just words. You don't have to conform to them if you don't want to. Mother's Day is worth celebrating because mothers are worth celebrating, yes, but that's no excuse to get hung up on that word mother. It's not about the title itself, it's what that person, no matter what kind of mother they are, gives you and will give you, or in the case of Woodstock's mom, what they gave you before they had to go. That's what you should cherish. I'm sorry, I just can't help myself. The shot with the tree is so brilliant, and then Patty, once she understands, comes around to the other side of the tree. It's so good, dude. There's a quote from a review for Auld Lang Syne that didn't necessarily inspire the creation of this video, but did accelerate its completion. Chuck Wilson, writing for The Village Voice, says, "The late Charles Schulz, who gave his characters the gifts of grace and intelligence, but also melancholy and doubt. This is ultimately what makes these specials and these comics valuable. It's that core of emotional honesty that comes from taking these sorts of emotions seriously with all mental faculties available." Schulz, like all true trailblazers, didn't know the kind of impact his storytelling would have on future generations. In his own words, all he knew how to be was the son of a barber from St. Paul.
I only know what it's like to grow up as a barber's son in St. Paul.
As kids, it's fairly common to feel like the adult world isn't taking you or your emotions seriously. You feel all these things, but there aren't many outlets for you to engage with them in any kind of constructive manner. Peanuts cuts right through all of that. The emotions on display are handled with care and explained succinctly. It's not about getting over it, it's about understanding all the aspects of your own humanity, the good and the bad. And through a dedication to that ethos put forth by Schulz himself, these newer Peanut specials are all Gold Star certified. There are so many easy ways to cash in on this series. They could have phoned it in, and not a single soul on this planet would have been surprised. There are more shameless cash grabs than there are stars in the skies these days, but the people making these new specials, they didn't take the easy way out. They chose to do things the hard way. They chose to honor the words and the thoughts of a man whose work resonates with people some 20 years after his passing and some 70 years after he first picked up a pencil. They chose to tell a new generation of young people stories worthy of their time and give them the tools to understand their own emotions in the same way Schulz did for them. They're paying it forward, and I couldn't thank them enough, even if I tried. In case you couldn't tell by all of that, that's a recommendation. Watch all of them now. Oh, and the other things, Snoopy and Space and the Snoopy Show, they're fine, more than serviceable, just like the old Charlie Brown and Snoopy Show. Okay, deuces.
Hey there, it's been a very long time, as you may or may not be aware. I'll try to post new videos to this channel once every other week. I may not have been making videos in these last 2 years, but I have been writing quite profusely, so stay tuned, alright? Thanks.